Coming up on today's Hot Zone, an interview with my new friend, Dr. Sean McFate, about his new book, The New Rules of War.
This is the Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
Hey folks, thanks for watching. I'm back home this week in West Virginia, actually just for 24 hours or so. I'm on the road and I got some interesting things coming up for you in the rest of the week. But today I want to just show you an interview that I did with Sean McFate. He's a professor at Georgetown University and an expert on the new rules of war. We're going to be talking about his new book. Check this out. All right, I've got foreign policy analyst, author, writer, novelist, I guess, Dr. Sean McFate.
McFate.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about yourself, Dr. McFate, and how you got into this business.
Well, I kind of started this business, if you will, the way most people do, by accident. I was a paratrooper in the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division. And then after doing that for many years, I got out and worked as a private military contractor, mostly in Africa. And then when I realized there were no old people in my line of work, I got out of that and became a scholar. And now I'm a professor at Georgetown University and also the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., where I teach strategy.
Tell me a little bit more about your, did you deploy in the 82nd or what year time frame were you in?
So I was in the 82nd. I was in the Army writ large from 92 to 2000.
Oh, okay. Wow.
And I got out because I thought the future would be nothing but peacekeeping. And so I want something a little bit more fast pace. But I had a great experience, at least with my paratrooper buddies in the 82nd. I worked under Stan McChrystal and David Petraeus when they're still colonels. Had a really rich experience.
Yeah, actually, Stanley McChrystal was my first company commander when I got into the Ranger Regiment back in 1988. So
really,
you and I both served under him. That's right. And
yeah,
what an amazing guy. Now, tell me a little bit more about your experience as a military contractor.
Well, so this is the weird thing is that I was I worked for a large private military company in Africa that was an American company, but then I got out of that and started doing things for smaller firms. And I was amazed to find out what is outsourced these days. I worked for not just the U.S. government, but also for oil companies and other things. And so initially, I worked for a large American private military company, mostly in Africa. I was their med in Africa. But then after that, I started working more freelance for oil companies, and I did private intelligence. And I was amazed by how you can get almost anything you want on the marketplace, special operations teams, CIA. Some of the work that I did, I can't go into details, but involves like putting warlords out of business in West Africa, helping Liberia raise a new military after Charles Taylor left, helping prevent a genocide in the Rwanda region in 2004, doing arms transfers from Eastern Europe to Africa, doing all sorts of stuff, doing strategic intelligence missions for oil companies in parts of the world. So all these things and more can now be outsourced to the clever buyer.
That's amazing. So tell me about, that must have been what gave rise to your book. Tell me a little bit about your new book that's coming out and give me the premise.
Sure. So the new book that just came out is called The New Rules of War. The foreword's by Stan McChrystal, our mutual commander, former commander. And he gives a very honest appraisal of JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command. And I wrote this book because I was angry. I, like you and probably many of your listeners or watchers, have lost friends in Afghanistan and Iraq. As an American taxpayer, I'm angry to see trillions sort of flush down the toilet of those places. And as a vet, I was angry to see American national honor tarnished by low-level foes. Meanwhile, we've achieved very little on the ground. And I wanted to know why. Because we have the best military, we have the best troops, the best technology, the most money. So what's the problem? And the problem is that, in my opinion, is that we are still fighting the old ways of war based on sort of conventional war or World War II. Meanwhile, our enemies are fighting what I call the new rules of war, whether it's Russia or China or ISIS or narco kings, you name it. War has moved on, but we have not. And what I've done in this book is propose 10 new rules of war to help us strategically do better. And these new rules of war are not what traditional warriors would think of as warfare. I think special operators and rangers, they'll get it. But I think if you're like more of a submarine captain or something, it'll look very, dangerous and naive.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the senior leadership in Washington today, in the military, at the Pentagon, is kind of still stuck in this 70s or 80s mold of warfare. They're trying very hard. I mean, I'm good friends with, for example, General Tony Thomas, who is a USASOC commander, and this guy is no dinosaur. He knows the deal. He's been in special ops his entire career. But like you say, I mean, I've also spent time with Eric Prince. I've spent time talking to some of those guys who own private armies, if you will, and they talk about how this is not a new concept. This is something that that PMCs can do cheaper, more effectively, and with fewer restrictions, and with a whole lot more covertness, I guess, than the U.S. military can, and with a lot smaller tooth to tail ratio. You know what I'm saying? So how do you feel about that?
Well, I've known Eric for a very long time, and I was actually last week I was at Oxford University debating Eric Prince on Al Jazeera TV. I think, Eric and I have a very similar background, and some of the things he says is right. Some of his other solutions I don't agree with, like his solution to replace troops in Afghanistan with mercenaries. I'm not sure that's a winning solution. But in general, I do think that warfare is becoming privatized once again, and that this should not surprise us. I mean, mercenaries, or whatever you want to call them, it's the second oldest profession. And most of military history is private military history. Only the last 150 years is anomalous. I mean, we all learned in sixth grade that only nation states can wage war, and they do it through their national armies. That's actually not what most of military history is. Military history is actually messier than that. And also, the book, The New Rules of War, is really about how warfare is changing in the 21st century. And what it's really changing into is it's getting sneakier. And it's getting more clandestine. And of course, this is where private military contractors excel. This is where special operations excel. This is why you see them rise, but you don't see naval battles and stuff like that. And we do have a senior generation, not just in the Department of Defense, but just in Washington, D.C., that's still kind of stuck someplace in 1960s, 70s, even the 40s. War's moved on. We have to move on with it. Our younger troops and our combat vets know this because they're coming back from the battlefield. They see what works.
So I'm really interested to kind of hear more about where you differ with Prince on his idea, because I've read a lot about that. I've spoken with him about it, of replacing most, if not much, of the troops that are currently in Afghanistan with private contractors. His points being it's cheaper. It can be more effective. They can be there more long term. There's not the turnover that you see with U.S. troops coming and going every 9 months or something like that. So what parts of that do you differ on?
Yeah, so I think the concept is fine. I think I would have more of a hybrid model than he wants to replace, they would almost exclusively be private military contractors. I would have more of a hybrid model. And I think privatization is a good thing for all the reasons he's outlined. And I do say constantly that a lot of people like to, sort of pejoratively dump on Eric Prince, but not everything he says is wrong. Where I diverge with him is he thinks that 6,500 guys turn around that country in 6 months. He's saying, that we can do all these things on a price point that's cheaper. That's the beginning, but that's not the end. So I want to hear more about his details about how you're going to professionalize what I consider to be a ragtag band of Afghans who might go into business for themselves, and how are you going to prevent that with 6,500 guys?
Yeah. Very interesting. Now, here's another question for you. Just recently returned from Venezuela, and when you look at what's going on there today, Maduro is actually not supported very much by his military. I spoke with the wives, for example, of several military officers who said, look, my husband does not support Maduro, but he is surrounded at all times by Russian mercenaries who make it impossible for us to get him out of there. So tell me what you know, or what can you tell me about that Russian private military contractor company in particular, and about that, what they've been doing not only in Venezuela but Syria and elsewhere as well.
Right. So Venezuela is a great example of the new rules of war. So when you want to hire, if you want to do what they call a zero footprint operation, you sometimes don't even use your special operations forces, like Russians would be Spetsnaz. You use mercenaries because you can really cut them loose and they can keep a secret. They have reasons to keep a secret. And this particular company is called the Wagner Group. It is a Russian private military company. It's a mercenary company. It works for the GRU, which is the Russian military intelligence, and but its mercenaries come from all over the Russian-speaking world. The world of mercenaries right now, it's sort of broken down by command language groups. So you have English speakers, Spanish speakers, Russian speakers. Then you have smaller groups like Israelis and Poles and stuff like that. But so the Wagner Group is used by the GRU to discipline wavering militaries and militias. So Russia used the Wagner Group during the Ukraine conflict to go in, and when these fake Russian separatist battalions, like the Donbass battalion, started to waver, the commanders we really don't want to be fighting this any longer. The Russians would send the Wagner Group to kneecap the leadership to instill discipline. And so my guess is that they're doing the same thing with the wavering Venezuelan military, saying, hey, if you ditch Maduro now, we're going to kill your commander horribly. And remember that, Maduro is being supported by China, Turkey, and Russia, the autocrats of the world. And I think that, and they know that if the center of gravity right now is the military, and if the Venezuelan military defects, then Maduro is done. And I think that's what the Wagner Group is doing in Venezuela secretly right now.
Yeah, nobody wants to be the first guy to stand up to Maduro and his 400 Wagner Group thugs, right?
Right. And these Wagner Group guys, they are high-end mercenaries. So these are not like lone dudes in the Congo jungles with Kalashnikovs. These are ex-Spetsnaz themselves. They are, and they're brutal. And that's what they're known for. So yeah, these are very competent, and you don't want to get on the bad side of them. And I think that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to intimidate the Venezuelan military.
So then what happened with those guys, the 300 of them that got killed by U.S. forces in Syria last year?
Well, this is a good question. So about 1 year ago, probably almost to the day, there was a battle in eastern Syria. 500 Wagner Group mercenaries attacked an American position it's a secret position in eastern Syria. And the Americans who were there, they were not like average troops. They were our elite. They were Delta, Rangers, Special Forces, Marines, and they had Kurdish militia around them. And then they called in And they were attacked by these 500 Wagner guys, and they called in B-52s, F-15s, AC-130 gunships. They called in Apache helicopters and drones. Our best troops, again, with our best aviation, and yet it still took them 4 hours to drive back 500 mercenaries, which, the Americans killed more Russians that night than we did during the entire Cold War in one night, right? Right? It's a lot.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, it took our best troops and best aviation 4 hours to beat back 500 mercenaries. Now, what happens if they're attacked by 5,000 mercenaries? Even an undefeated army can lose. And so, in some ways, it was a defeat for Wagner Group, but in other ways, it's sort of proof of concept that the world of private warfare has evolved and is a lot more lethal today than it was just 10 years ago.
Yeah, without a doubt. Do you write about that particular event in your book?
I do. I write up one of the new rules of war. I give 10 new rules. One of the rules is that mercenaries are returning, and it's changing the way we fight war. And I talk about this. And the way it changes, it's going back to the world of Machiavelli. Suddenly, sort of military strategies now blend with market ones. It's like Clausewitz meets Adam Smith. And our 4-stars do not know how to fight that type of warfare. But maybe our CEOs do. So we need to rethink, how do you fight warfare? Because if you're fighting marketized forces, there might be other strategies you can use, like buying out all the mercenaries or doing other things. You can manipulate the market for victory. It's not just, Clausewitz killing on the battlefield. So we need to be savvier to market warfare, like marketized warfare, and talk about how to do that.
I guess that would also pose another risk to us, because if we could buy them out, so could Russia, or so could somebody else. And so they could use those against us for sure. So tell me, give me some stats on PMCs in the world today. How many are there? How many troops are there? What are their capabilities? That sort of thing.
So we don't really know exactly, because there's no sort of like Bureau for Mercenary Labor and Statistics. But we do know it's a growing field. So if you go back like 30 years ago and you were to say to somebody then that America would be using private military contractors in foreign wars, most people would say that's insane. No, we wouldn't. If you go back 10 years ago and say that the world would be using mercenaries once again in high numbers, people would say, no, that's insane. We would never do that. But that's exactly the world we are in today. So what started as an American, America kind of started, some of this really kind of started after, the end of apartheid, with groups like Executive Outcomes, and then groups like Blackwater, which really weren't mercenaries, but they were privately armed guys. But that kind of set the stage for like what happens when the U.S. no longer uses these. Some of those guys ended up working for anybody. And now we're seeing mercenaries in Ukraine, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Nigeria, Venezuela, the Congo, Somalia. It's now a booming market. And we're getting to the point where anybody who's rich enough to hire mercenaries can, and they can wage war for any reason they want. Random billionaires, Fortune 500, countries, you name it. And so we're seeing mercenaries from Latin America, from Russia, from, the Five Eyes countries. They're everywhere. And right now, the biggest places are Yemen and Syria. And also, but it's been Nigeria used mercenaries to drive out Boko Haram. And Nigerian military, which is not a weak African standards, 6 years it could not deal with Boko Haram. In 2015, the Nigerian government secretly hired mercenaries to assist the military, and they drove out Boko Haram in weeks. And these guys showed up with special operations forces and Mi-24 attack helicopters. These are like flying tanks. These are no longer just the caricatures of Hollywood villains. These are high-end, professional, competent, lethal teams. And now they're on the auction block.
Yeah, I remember at one point during the Afghanistan conflict several years ago, I know that Prince had something like 260 aircraft in country. So it's not just a bunch of guys running around with guns, but they had serious assets at their disposal. And like you said, plausible deniability. and even cyber capabilities, right?
Yeah. So there are mercenaries in all domains of warfare except space. We see land mercenaries. We see them on the sea. They act like privateers. They do anti-piracy in Somalia, in the Gulf of Guinea and Gulf of Aden. And frankly, the insurance world encourages that to some extent, for freighters going through pirate waters. We're seeing private air forces, people take cheap drones off the shelf and modify them into kamikaze drones. And that's becoming ever more sophisticated. We're also seeing cyber mercenaries. So these are called hackback companies. And what this is they're just like mercenaries in the cybersphere. They're hackers, and you hire them to protect your company. And the way it works is that they can't, if you get hacked by Russian or Chinese hackers or whomever, your stuff is going to be gone. You can't get it back. But what you can do is have your hackers track down and basically destroy whoever hacked you. They hack back. And the idea is that they act as a deterrent. So if I'm a Russian hacker and you're a soft target next to somebody with you're like an insurance company, and there's another insurance company, and if one of you has a hackback company behind you, I'm not going to attack you. I'm going to attack the softer target. Now, right now, hackback is illegal in the United States, and I think in many EU countries, but people are starting to rethink that as hackers get more brazen and more effective, and like the NSA does very little to protect civilian cyber sector.
Wow, I am so excited to read this book. I can't wait to get a copy of it. And I hope our listeners will too. Thank you so much. And it's really been fascinating talking to you. I hope to get you on again. I mean, you're obviously a wealth of knowledge in the area of hot zones all around the world. And so I really appreciate you taking some time to talk to us.
Sure, Chuck, anytime. I look forward to it.
All right, take care.
The Hot Zone is produced by Amy Holton and Livefire Media. Copyright 2019.